Rishi Sunak faces a pivotal moment in his premiership. Can he convince his MPs to back his Rwanda plan? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, Labour MP Dame Margaret Hodge, non-affiliated peer Baroness Claire Fox and the Editor-in-Chief of National World, Nancy Fielder. Today.
Are you going to vote against the bill?
Breakfast in Downing Street for MPs on the right of the Conservative Party as the Prime Minister and ministers plead for support.
And I will listen to colleagues from right across the breadth of our parliamentary party, hopefully addressing each and every one of their concerns and encouraging them, that word again, trying to persuade them to join me in the division lobby this evening.
But can the rebels be convinced?
Because the bill has a lot of holes in it, in layman's English, they'd be better to pull that legislation and come back with something which is fit for purpose.
Keir Starmer puts the boot in.
While they're swanning around self-importantly with their factions and their star chambers, fighting like rats in a sack, there's a country out here that isn't being governed.
Also today,
those on the lowest incomes, people coming off welfare, women, ethnic minorities, those working part-time.
did COVID lockdowns hit the poorest hardest?
This text will not be acceptable.
Would you walk away if the text doesn't change?
If this doesn't change, yes, it will not be accepted as a text.
Anger at the climate summit over failure to agree on phasing out fossil fuels. Let's start with the crunch vote that is taking place this evening in Parliament for the Prime Minister's Rwanda plan. It's very uncertain at this point in the day as to whether the government will get its key legislation through. Now, defeat at what we call second reading, when MPs debate main principles of a bill, would leave Rishi Sunak in a perilous position, and his authority will have been dealt a hammer blow. These are sentiments all reflected in the right-wing press. Let's have a look at some of them. The Daily Mail, on the front page, Tories in turmoil, down to the wire. In the Daily Express, their front page, last-ditch bid to win over rebels. And finally, in the Daily Telegraph, the former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, do not let Rwanda row bring down government. Well, he is going to try and get his plan through today. Let's talk to the panel and get their views. And first of all, how they're going to vote. Ian Duncan-Smith, will you vote for or against the bill?
I think it's important that the government gets its second reading. I think on balance there are flaws in this bill. I'm divided on either side of it because I was one of those that introduced the modern-day slavery stuff, and I wanted to see where the changes, and I also believe we have to sort out the illegal migration routes across the Channel, which are dangerous. So we can debate whether it's effective or not, but I think the government at least has to get their second reading now, because I think all in all we can have these rows in the committee stage and in the report stages to decide whether it needs tightening up or whatever, and that will at least allow us and the public to see what the purpose of all this is. If we stop it now, I'm afraid that we just start all over again and we lose further confidence with the public. I think it's important, so I shall support it.
Which way will you vote, Margaret?
Oh, I will vote against. Because I think it's a gimmick. I don't think it'll work.
Oh, we're going to come back to you in just a moment because apparently, annoyingly, your microphone isn't working. So we'll come back to you in just a moment. You've just heard Ian Duncan-Smith, Claire, say that there will be battles further down the line. And there will be. Even if it gets through this evening, it will have to go through various stages in Parliament, including in the Lords. Which way will you vote if it makes it to the Lords?
The Lords is peculiar because I won't want to be supporting the government, but I think it is worth saying that, in response to what Ian has just noted, that I think the public are already fed up with the Rwanda deal because they've already lost confidence. The difficulty with the Rishi Sunak bill is, forget what you think about the morality of outsourcing to Rwanda. The problem is that if it doesn't work, which is what some Conservative MPs are saying, then that just adds to the cynicism of the whole situation. So, I mean, it doesn't really, you know, you can say, well, let's give it a second reading, but if legally it's going to be stopped again. So I think that the crisis we've got is that from a voter's point of view, you can vote whichever way you want, you can demand this of your politicians, then suddenly the law courts get in the way. It's almost as though you know the law courts are going to stop it, which leads to even greater alienation by voters from politicians.
Let's try you again. Margaret, which way will you vote? Yes, I'm hoping you are.
Can you hear me? I am going to vote against, because I actually agree with quite a lot that Claire has said. It is a gimmick. It's costing a fortune, £290 million is what we've been told, and they're not giving us, I'm sure Ian would agree with us, they're not giving us the true cost of it. So far we've had 3 Home Secretaries who've gone out there on that. It is going to be challenged in the law. I mean, you can say what you like, but there will be challenges both in the domestic courts and there will be challenges in Europe. And I don't think it actually meets what is required. I mean, can I just take the argument that we hear so much about, that it puts people off, it'll put people off. A deterrent. It's a deterrent. Do you know, there's 79 people were killed in trying to get across the waters in those small boats. If death doesn't provide a deterrent to people using it, why on earth would this provide an effective deterrent?
Let me just come to Nancy. Which way should MPs vote this evening?
The problem with this is the Westminster bubble at its absolute grimmest. There are people who are scared. Hundreds and thousands of people in this country are scared to put their heating on. There are people who've got Christmas with no presents for their children, no food on the table. We understand that this is an issue. Nobody wants to see people dying on the beaches trying to reach us. We understand that immigration is also a massive political problem and that there's a lot of division around it. But actually, we're not talking about the issues that are changing people's lives that could make this country better. And it just feels like what happened last time there was a big Conservative Party split. Well, David Cameron went, didn't he? And then he's come back. It's infighting that's making no difference to the lives that people are supposed to represent.
All right, let's talk to our political correspondent, Hannah Miller. She's in Central Lobby. Hannah, what are the possible outcomes at this evening's vote?
I mean, there are essentially, ultimately, only 2 options for Rishi Sunak. He either gets this bill through or he doesn't. But in terms of how MPs can vote, they're facing 3 choices. One is to vote for it and then hope for amendments and changes further down the line. Rishi Sunak seems to have indicated to some of the new Conservative group this morning, who he met over breakfast, that he's open to tweaking the bill. So it's possible that some of them might therefore vote for it and hope to see those tweaks. They can also, of course, abstain, and you would need around 60 or so to abstain, 60, 70, depending on how other parties vote, for the government to be defeated. Or MPs can choose to block the vote and to block the bill and vote no completely. Fewer of them are expected to do that, but I think it's very possible that tonight we see a kind of 3-way split, even among those who don't particularly like this bill as it stands at the moment.
And what will it mean for the government, for Rishi Sunak, if they fail and it loses?
I mean, there would be very little hope of getting a Rwanda bill in anything like its current form through Parliament before a general election, as if this doesn't go ahead in its current form tonight. I think in many ways it would be the end of that policy as it stands at the moment. Whether there are other mechanisms he might choose to look at to meet that flagship pledge of stopping the boats, who knows? But ultimately you would have a situation where a government that was elected 4 years ago with a huge majority wouldn't be able to pass a key piece of legislation, and that will raise huge questions about his authority and his capacity to govern that you wouldn't have expected to be having those kind of questions at this stage in the passage of a bill.
All right, Hannah Miller, we'll leave it there for now, but come back to you if you speak to any MPs who have made up their minds, if they are still thinking about it. We know there's another meeting this afternoon with various groups, factions on the Conservative right. Do you think it will get through this evening, Ian?
On balance, I think it will. I think that most people don't want to see it die on second reading because it is a very important debate where I agree with you on lots and stuff, but on the idea of deterrence does work. We're not alone, by the way. Across Europe, this is a hiatus going on. France is already in full defiance of the court in Strasbourg. They've said they are sending people back to Syria, and they're talking about another one directly going back they consider to be illegal. Denmark's passed legislation.
Yes, but it didn't actually go ahead in the end. They did go down a similar line, but they didn't go ahead.
The point I'm making is Denmark passed legislation as well, and they now send people away straight away. Now, here's the key point. Sweden complained to them. Sweden's now passing the same legislation. Germany's talking. There's a big problem going on here about this. Now, the point I'd make about the boats is very simple. Yes, you're right. They chance everything on this because if they get to the British shores, their view is then they will be okay. Most will get asylum. The point here is how do you stop them doing that by deterring them? If it isn't a deterrence, well then...
So what's your message to all the MPs who will? There will be a number of your MPs, if you think it's so critical and so important and that lots of other European countries are doing or thinking about similar things, what do you say to those that are endless meetings about whether or not to support Rishi Sunak? Do they want the government to fall?
No, I just think sometimes you've got to take a pace back in politics and ask yourself a very simple question. What is it that you're actually after? Sometimes you can't get everything, but you need to figure out what it is that's essential that you need to do. So we're going to differ in the Labour Party and the Conservatives over this, no question. But I think that this was a pledge made to the public, and I saw polling today that said they want this delivered on. So the government has to deliver on it, and that's why we need the second reading, I believe.
I want to say a number of things. First of all, this is only stage one. I think it'll get through tonight, actually, but we're going to end up with now 2, 3, 4 months of absolutely battering. And you just look at it, Joe. You've got within the Parliamentary Conservative Party, you've got 100 on the left, you've got 100 on the right, and I have to tell you, that'll end up in chaos.
Right.
And then the other thing, that's the first thing to say. And then the other thing to say is, I so agree with this. People really care at the moment about the cost of living coming up to Christmas, and they care about the health service. And what's this government for? What is this government doing? Get off these sort of, internal... no, but it's an internal argument, Ian. It's not even attacking the problem that we all accept as a problem. It's an internal argument. It doesn't allow you really to do anything about people coming over in boats. We have a plan for it, which I can tell you, Joe, if you want.
Well, let's hold on to it for the moment.
But this doesn't deal with that, and it doesn't deal with the real issues. It's a scandal.
Taking down the Prime Minister that nobody in this country, except Conservatives, have had a say on anyway. It's absolutely ludicrous.
Right. I mean, isn't that the possibility that it could...
It is a possibility, but I do think that... I do want to suggest that whilst this is a Westminster bubble story in terms of what factions and so on, I don't think it's right to say that nobody cares about the issue of controlling the borders, because actually a lot of people do. I'm just suggesting. And that this idea that it's pitted against cost of living misses the point. It's become a lightning rod, and the lightning rod is this. We voted for something, we decided something, this is the public, not... And you won't deliver it. My problem with Ian's response is this bill won't deliver it.
Yep.
So, and actually, if you look at the debate, it's actually broadly moved on now, which is to legal migration, where people say, well, actually, even legal migration, you behind the scenes have allowed people by changing the rules.
Yep.
So I think that the danger is that the government might fall on a bill which is never going to satisfy the European courts. Actually, Ian is completely right, though. Other European countries are being braver in terms of defining the EHRC than this government, which has decided to
then there are two things. Do you think the government should pull the bill, as suggested by one of the potential Conservative rebels, Mark Francois? Should they just pull the Rwanda plan?
I think the Rwanda bill is not fit for purpose. It's going to lead to the law courts and not to a democratic
Well, let me just show you that you're sticking with it for now, but there's an implicit threat that later, further down the line, as it travels through Parliament, you'll change it. And you'll change it to alienate, which will alienate, as Margaret talked, the other side of the Conservative divide. The Daily Telegraph, the government must strengthen Rwanda bill and deliver on its promise to voters. This is Simon Clarke. He was in Liz Truss's government. There have been so many, it's hard to keep up. Question is whether Rishi Sunak's legislation will stop the boats, and it's clear it's unlikely to do so because he thinks there will be legal challenges. So are you going to keep pushing for tightening up the legislation so much that, in fact, what will happen is you will breach international law?
Look, I'm sure we will look to do things in different ways. As I said earlier on, I introduced the modern-day slavery stuff. I'd like protections and things like that in there. But whether we get them or we don't, the truth is, right now, the government, the Prime Minister, made a very personal pledge that he would stop the boats. And deterrence is... you're right, quite right, by the way. There are two big issues. There's legal migration, which the government made some big announcements about this day. It's down to the government and what they need to bring in, and it's about modernising things like social services to make sure you don't have cheap, poorly paid people doing work which other countries don't do. But there's lots of ways you can do that. But on a legal migration, which is where they're actually taking the boats across, this is both dangerous and it punches a hole through the idea that actually there have to be safe routes.
Yes,
so
all right.
Getting safe routes and stopping the boats is a critical part, even for the Labour Party on this one.
So
they don't argue against that.
Ian, even your government doesn't believe this is going to stop the boats. Why else are they putting out a contract to deal with all the people who they expect to come on those boats until 2030? I mean, it's just a nonsense of the art. I think the problem is, I'm afraid it's the Conservative Party falling apart, and I don't say this with any great joy, because I think it's important we have two strong political parties. But you've got Rishi, in a way, trying to be Liz Truss on the one hand, trying to be David Cameron on the other hand, and unable to bring together. And the end of that is they're putting the party first, not the country first. And people are fed up. They're not fed up with Rishi, they're fed up with the Conservatives.
Immigration is such a big issue because nothing works in this country. And it's easy to turn against people who don't look like us, who don't sound about us. So the NHS is on its knees, the trains don't function, schools are crippled, and so let's turn against people who look different. This is why immigration is
I think that's a slur on the public, to be fair. I don't think it's a kind of racist blame.
I'm not saying it's racism, I'm saying that the systems aren't working.
I agree
so
with that
who do we blame for that?
No, but I don't actually think that what's happened is the public are going, so anyone who doesn't look like us who is foreign. They are perfectly reasonably saying this country is something that we should have a say in. That's democracy, right? And we made a decision to control the borders of this country, whereas it seems that they're porous. It doesn't mean to say that everyone's going around going, I don't like that person because they're an immigrant, right? That is really unfair.
I'm not saying that, but I think it's about a numbers game.
I just do not think it's the same scapegoating as we saw in the 70s
well, hang on.
and 80s.
But then it is about blame, because it's a government that has talked about immigration endlessly. In fact, to use that phrase, banging on about immigration, rightly or wrongly. But legal migration, the government's chosen and has chosen to change the system in the way you said, and we've had record levels of net migration. The Rwanda plan that you're all squabbling over is still not going through Parliament. You can understand why people are thinking, what is happening to the government and the Conservative Party?
And half of the problem, I know lots of businesses I met in the course of the Brexit debates in Europe. And one of the things they said to me is, we look at the UK as the cheap labour capital of the West, because you never make long-range decisions. You don't invest in technology. You don't improve the quality of what you do. And you get by year on year by getting cheaper labour, which doesn't get properly trained.
Let me ask you a straight question then.
That is part of the tackling of legal migration, which is to take the demand away and make sure that those who work here are therefore better trained, there's more technology used, and they get better
And the Conservatives have been in power for 13 years. Yeah. But let me just ask you this question about the bill itself. If there are amendments to tighten up the legislation, as the readout from number 10 seems to imply, in order to keep MPs like you and others on board, will you support amendments that tighten it up, that make it impossible for there to be legal challenges?
Well, I'm going to look at everything that goes on. I will make my own personal decisions. I have not, by the way, as you might have suggested just then, done any deals with the government. I don't do deals with the government. I have decided myself that I would prefer this to go to second reading so that it goes in to be properly debated, which is what we're supposed to be about. Well, I know it may be frustrating for the public, but the truth about democracy is we want those debates because they unearth problems and they also settle decisions.
But I've been in so many debats. Damien Green won't support it if he does that. So
and he's from the One Nation Conservatives.
And can I just say something on what Claire was going on? I'm an immigrant. We came here not out of choice. Not out of choice. We were threatened with persecution, and my parents came from two countries. And actually, a lot of immigration is not out of choice. People don't choose to leave their communities and their families. They get forced either threat of persecution, poverty, global warming. It can be all sorts of things. And I do think, and I think, Claire, you and I might agree on this, the whole discourse of how we tackle migration as politicians is completely wrong. It's a feature of what's happening, you know, in the world now for all those reasons. And if you really want to do something to stop some of the migration you're getting, of course, do things at home about training, but also do things about helping developing countries
also,
so that you deal with
Margaret,
the poverty.
One thing that I would say is that there's a lot going on. There's a security issue. There is a feeling that communities are being completely disrupted, not just because there's a lack of services, but because of a lack of cohesion. And we have seen recently, in relation to what's happened in Israel and the demonstrations, what can only be described as tensions. And those tensions, I mean, you know, are going on with people calling for Sharia law in some areas, genuinely. I mean, you do think...
I had to deal with those in Barking when I had the BMP there. And you can build social cohesion and acceptance of diversity.
But what's happened is it's not happening now, and behind the backs of the public, things have changed. By the way, on the legal migration point and the things that were brought in, the government are so keen on going, something must be done, but we're not going to look at it too carefully. They brought in ridiculous rules about the salaries that people have to be earning in order to
threshold.
And I know, Ian, that you're very keen on the family. This was not a great moment for family cohesion when the government, in order to what they think the public are racist. Like, oh, if we do that,
so we can't bring a spouse from abroad.
It's ridiculous.
All right, well, just park that for the moment because we are still talking about illegal migration, as the government calls it, and the Rwanda plan. Can I just show you this news headline? Bibi Stockholm, that is one of the barges looked at. The asylum seeker on board barge dies. And we are certainly hearing from a number of sources via the BBC that the asylum seeker took their own life. I mean, this is a real situation, isn't it, going on while the government and the Conservative Party row over what to do about illegal migration.
But whatever the row is here right now, you know, when people come to seek asylum for various reasons, some of them turn out to be economic people, but others generally come for asylum. So the problem you get, if it isn't controlled, is that those who are really genuine asylum seekers, and I was really keen on the modern-day slavery legislation for the reason that we can separate them out and deal with them in a decent and reasonable way. The problem when you get the scale that we've had is that it becomes very difficult to cope with who is really the asylum seeker, and we want to show them compassion and help them, and that's the key. And so you end up with this situation.
Well, we don't know why this asylum seeker...
Well, hang on. Well, no, but this is from several sources within the BBC. No, we don't know why, but certainly that is a cause. Can I just say, because, Margaret, you brought up the issue of cost, and it's a bone of contention, of course, the amount of money that has been spent so far. And yesterday, Matthew Rycroft, the most senior civil servant at the Home Office, was cross-examined by MPs about the cost of the scheme. I think we can just have a listen.
Will the 50 million that's now been, you've now said is going to be paid next year...
It's due to be paid next year.
It's due to be paid, and these will be paid. There's no ability to opt out of these payments, I take it?
Well, there is a break clause in the memorandum of understanding.
So they could still have the money with having actually not had to receive a single asylum seeker?
It would depend on the circumstances.
And if we break it, they keep it?
Yes, broadly speaking, yes.
Are you happy with that, Duncan?
Well, you make it's coming up to... I didn't negotiate it, but the contract...
Yeah, but if no one's been sent, and £290 million has already been given to Rwanda. I mean, they talk about break clauses. He didn't seem particularly sure about what the actual arrangement was. If no one goes, they keep the money.
Well, that's what the contract's all about. What you negotiate, you have to agree to. All I'm saying simply...
But MPs are the ones making the decisions about this on behalf of constituents.
Well, actually, they aren't. They aren't. The interesting thing on that, if I can just say, in defence of you, the Secretary of State had the permanent secretary got what is called a letter of direction on it, which meant that the civil service didn't believe that this was value for money and therefore should be expended. And it was entirely a Secretary of State, God knows which one because they changed so quickly, but it was entirely a Secretary of State decision.
I am aware of that, I understand that. Yeah.
So it wasn't, this time it wasn't Ian, but it was in crazy ways.
Is it proving to be value for money?
Well, it will prove to be value to money if it succeeds in doing what it's meant to do, because at the moment you have so many hotels all over the UK where the problems that you were talking about earlier on, Claire, are existing, where people are a huge amount of money, billions is being expended to keep them there because we can't process them quickly enough.
Ian.
This is meant to be saving money in the
Ian.
longer term that you would otherwise spend.
Ian, it's
so we can argue about that one way or the other.
100 people going to Rwanda, and I can't remember, what is it, 27,000 came
because
on
it's
the
supposed to be a
boat this year.
it's supposed to be a deterrent.
You look at the deterrence factor.
100.
Honestly, Margaret, the idea is deterrence. Australia, it worked for them, so you say, right, OK, when you deter people, they don't come, that's the money you save when they don't have to be put up in hotels.
Right, well, hang on.
We can debate that all day, I understand that.
Well,
but that's what this is about.
You are debating it all day.
If this doesn't work as a deterrent, then it will have failed.
Just before I go to you still haven't answered, how far are you prepared to go with the courts? Do you want to pull out of our international treaties in order to reduce and completely block any claims ending up in the courts?
No, I personally think you will always have to have personal claims. It's part of common law, it's part of our system, it's the way that we give justice to people, but there are limits to the degree that is set, and that's what this bill is meant to be about.
Margaret, you could be inheriting this, not you personally, but the Labour Party under Keir Starmer. No, indeed. He's delivered a speech this morning because it's 4 years since Labour lost catastrophically in 2019 at the general election. Then he was asked about what Labour would do if in power when it comes to illegal migration.
Are you against the Rwanda scheme in particular, or could a Labour government ever consider processing asylum seekers in third countries?
The direct answer to your question is very important, because there are various schemes, as you know, around the world where individuals are processed, usually en route to their country of destination, elsewhere. The Rwanda scheme isn't one of those. This is a straight deportation scheme in relation to people who've already arrived. Other countries around the world do have schemes where they divert people on the way and process them elsewhere. That's a different kind of scheme. And look, I'll look at any scheme that might work.
So you will look at any scheme that might work, and that might include then a third country being involved. OK, not a straightforward deportation scheme, as he calls the Rwanda plan, but he might look at another country where, you know, they could process the asylum claims before they come and settle here.
Well, I would feel, you know, we might do. I think that what you're going to do is do it a step at a time. So the first thing is to have a serious squad of people who Keir said he would use some of the 290 million quid that we're spending in Rwanda to fund, sitting in the National Crime Agency, really going after the smugglers, step one. Step two, he is going to recruit 1,000 more individuals who will just get rid of this awful, awful, awful backlog. And then I think beyond that, step three, you've got to control your borders. I think we all agree you've got to be able to control your borders. And the backlog shows that's not there. But have a sensible policy which accepts that the issue of migration is a feature of today's world, but ensures that we build social cohesion by doing it in a better way.
Are they going to find it any easier, Labour, to deal with this?
I think it's going to be difficult for anyone to deal with it, and at the moment they're not under the same pressure.
But if they win the election, I mean...
No, I know. So I'm saying they're going to be under enormous pressure. I mean, we've seen in relation to... One of the problems that the Labour Party's got in terms of factions is it's bought into, in my opinion, very wrongly, identity politics far too much. And we've seen the dangers of that only spilling over recently in relation to the Israel-Gaza question. I'm not trying to divert us down that road, but you can see that it's difficult for Keir Starmer, who, by the way, to his credit, has held firm on that in relation to Israel. I think that what the Labour Party needs to do, which I wish the Tories had done, is say we need an asylum system fit for purpose in 2023 and start from scratch. And that might mean pulling out of some of our international obligations because they were conceived of post the war. Every time in the law do we talk about this issue, illegal boats, somebody cites kindergarten, kinder transport, you know, Lord Dubs speaks... There's great tears, as though we're talking about the same thing, and we're just not. And therefore, we need to start from scratch, and that's what I hope.
Do you agree? Do you think it's going to be any easier for Labour?
No, I think it's always going to be a problem. It's always going to be really hard to solve. But I think we're not going about it the right way. We could sit here. So look how much has been spent on this, and actually, what is the aim? What would be success? Because we're not going to be able to stop the problem completely. So COP so much money been spent on it. What is the aim and what? And again, the COVID inquiry. What actually is the aim? Who's learning lessons? And yet, extraordinary amounts of money have been spent on all of them.
You've mentioned the COVID inquiry, but before we discuss that, the MPs have begun debating the bill, the Rwanda plan. You can see it's quite full inside the chamber. It's going to be a long day. We're expecting the votes and the crunch vote at about 7 o'clock this evening, so there is plenty of time for discussion. But as Nancy was saying, the Prime Minister was at the COVID inquiry yesterday, which we covered on the programme, and while speaking about Treasury policy on lockdowns, he said this.
And those sectors of the economy, and this is a really important point, that were most impacted by lockdown, these consumption sectors, hospitality, leisure, tourism, retail, disproportionately employed people who were the most vulnerable in society. Those on the lowest incomes, people coming off welfare, women, ethnic minorities, those working part-time. So those jobs, I think, as a matter of social justice, were particularly important to try and safeguard.
So the Centre for Social Justice, founded by you, the think tank, published a report yesterday that looked at the economic situation in the country of the least well-off particularly. The Prime Minister was Chancellor, of course, at the time, and says the Treasury was aware of the impact of lockdowns on the least well-off. Do you think they did enough?
I think we made a major error. The figures that we've produced in this report are shocking. A huge spiralling increase in mental health problems amongst young people. We've now had people going missing from school, a rise of 134%. We've got ghost children now. You know, if you were a single mum in the 5th or 6th story of a tower block with 2 kids, you were crammed into transport because they cut down, you know, local authorities cut down the transport. You have to get to work, probably to give the Amazon books that go off to the middle classes sitting in their gardens. And meanwhile, you've got 2 kids. While they're at school, you can cope. They're not at school now. Schools are locked down. Even though we discovered that this was a virus that wasn't affecting younger people, we still shut the schools down. That left her struggling. So the mental health of both her and her kids gets worse, and they disappear from school. They then become prey to gangs, which is what's in the report. What we didn't, and I love all this stuff about this inquiry going on, but I think they're splashing around in the shallow end of what's going on. We should really be looking at what are the lessons learned, and the biggest lesson has to be that we have to, you know, we have to make sure who is at risk, and the rest need to be supported and make sure they can go on with their lives, because we didn't do that.
All right.
Blanket lockdowns do not work, and I think we destroyed lives as a result of it, and that's the lesson that this lot in the inquiry should be talking about, not who wrote WhatsApp messages to somebody else swearing at them. My goodness gracious. And a year and a half, that's where we've got to. Well, that's a travesty.
But Ian, the report does say that lockdowns were the dynamite that blew open the gap between haves and have-nots. It also says this gap was stretching apart after years of increased family fragility, stagnating wages, poor housing and frayed community life. You've obviously read it.
I agree.
That was under your watch. That was under Conservative government's watch. So it may have exacerbated and made it much worse, but that situation was already
Poverty
there.
started to rise under both governments, and then it started to come down. But the key point, I just want to come to this one. The reforms we try to make with universal credit, etc., are a way of being able to resolve this. The problem that took place with lockdown, it took this out of all magnitude. So in reality, what actually happened was that all of these became not just worse, but catastrophically worse. Now we have to settle it. And the report's coming back with things that we need to do. It's cross-party, and it should be looked at, because it's got Labour and Liberal and Conservatives on it, including others like the Governor of the Bank of England.
Should Labour have been more critical of lockdowns?
Can I just first of all say I do want to commend Ian for the work he's doing. I think it's really, really helpful work, and it adds to the debate, and I really do welcome it. So that's the first thing to say. Second thing is, Ian is right. I think we should look at lockdown, the impact. I mean, I see it. I don't know if you see it with your... I see it with my grandchildren. You know, kids aren't going to school, increase in mental health problems. That's all true. But equally, Ian, you cannot, you know, to say that child poverty was going up under Labour, it wasn't. It was the one thing Gordon Brown was absolutely determined to do. And in the years of the Labour government, we cut child poverty by 800,000. In the years of the Conservative government, you take it from 2010, it's gone up by 600,000. And if you look at things that really matter, that could help, you know, bridge the gap, things like investment in education, that's gone down by about 8.5–9% in real terms since the Conservatives came in. Sure Stop, My Dream, that's been destroyed by the Labour
you think that there was pressures? Those pressures were already in existence, as the report seems to imply. But on lockdown, is hindsight a wonderful thing, Nancy?
Hindsight is a wonderful thing, and I think there are also, I mean, social media, the great sort of gaps between digital and what access kids had when they were at home. There are so many issues around this. But I think fundamentally, again, we've got a report which gets us talking, but actually you could go to any teacher and they can tell you all these things. There are so many children who are really, really struggling, and teachers have been described recently as the fourth emergency service because it's about feeding kids. Even in lockdown, they had to go around with food parcels because there was nobody else doing it. And actually, even if you don't care about people and you look financially, investing in pregnant mothers even, let alone newborn babies, and getting them while they're young changes all of this. It helps with knife crime, it helps with education, it helps with everything. Instead, it's always something's gone wrong, let's fix it. Why don't we properly invest and help people from the start?
Well, I mean, Rishi Sunak said he was making some of these arguments, but he was also clear to say that the health message was as important. It was important that the message was simple from government. Do you think he didn't do enough to make those arguments?
Well, first of all, I thought he did himself some credit if you watched him in the COVID inquiry. I thought he was perfectly straightforward. He seemed to understand what was going on. He actually tried to broaden the debate, and I'm afraid the inquiry tried to narrow it every time he tried to broaden it out, and they tried to close it down, which was unhelpful. I think that however, I would have urged him to have been braver in view of the fact that we had the complete suspension of civil liberties, a destruction of society as we know it, with catastrophic impact. By the way, when you say hindsight, some of us were saying this.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
No, but I'm just making the point. And I'm afraid that when you were saying it, and arguing it in Parliament, my fellow peers, Labour Party, I'm afraid, the Conservative Party, treated me as though I was some sort of utter lunatic. And we discussed, and, you know, we're actually labelling people who just simply raised the balance. I said schools shouldn't be closed down. This was going to have a devastating impact on young people, lead to institutionalised truancy, and I was right, would mean that the vulnerability existed and so on and so forth. All of that was true. And people said, oh, COVID denier, you know, conspiracy monger. Now, there were conspiracists around, but those people who were seriously trying to raise this, now the difficulty we've got is we've got an inquiry which is costing a fortune, I agree with you on this, which is just not asking any of these questions. We'll never be able to be in a situation as a country where we say, lockdown never again, what could we do to avoid it?
But there were health impacts.
No,
and people making those decisions at the time had people's lives in their hands,
I know,
Claire,
but
and it was more difficult for them to say...
health was not just COVID. We know from the cancer things.
Yeah,
but by the way,
Claire, you would have taken a brave person at that point. I mean, of course we've got to learn the lessons, and of course we've got to learn the right lessons, but it would have taken a brave person at that point to say, we are going to go down the route to make sure that children still go to school, or make sure that hospitality jobs, and that means more people will die.
Debate,
and we got the evidence. When was it? We got the evidence? Was it on the Eat Out Health? We got the evidence that had a direct...
But we knew that children were at risk from this virus. We had the scientific evidence.
Don't all talk over each other. We did a bit of Eat Out to help out yesterday. I mean, there was a study done by the University of Warwick, I think it was, that said, yes, there was an impact, but nothing compared to the outbreak or the spreading of the virus in January 2021, and this was August 2020. 20%, they said, and it lifted the mood of the nation. But there was an impact. Just finally, and then we need to move on. Ian, on the report. I mean, what do you think is going to come out of it now?
Well, I commend the report.
The report is where this inquiry should be. Exactly. All around Europe, they've had their studies, they've had their reports, and they've published them on what needs to happen. We've taken 18 months, and we're still in the bits that are interesting to the media, but not to the public. The public wants to know what went wrong, not because they want to blame everybody, because as Margaret says, it was a difficult time. But what's the lesson we learn in future potential pandemics? If it affects comorbidities in older people, protect them. If it's not going to affect children, then get them free from that restriction. These are the kind of things this inquiry should be dealing with, and not just talking about who was rude to who and how chaotic was it in government. If you'd been in 1940 when they were thinking about whether they would carry on fighting or not, and then had WhatsApp, you'd have had a field day on some of the stuff they had said. This is irrelevant. What's relevant is what was the decision and why.
Well, let's talk about something else that is relevant, and that is the COP28, the climate summit. The Financial Times headline, oil states face outrage as fossil fuel phase out, which is the key term, dropped from the COP draft. It is the last day of that climate summit, but a draft deal has caused controversy and disappointment. Let's talk to our climate editor, Justin Rowlatt, who's at the summit in Dubai. Hello to you. What is the latest from the summit?
We're waiting for the next text. In fact, we're well into overtime. The summit was supposed to end at 11 o'clock and it is now, 5 p.m? So we're well into overtime. We're expecting the text to drop about 6, so in about an hour's time. Then we'll see what kind of compromise has been negotiated between all the different positions. As you say, the fossil fuel rich countries led by Saudi Arabia negotiated down the text on fossil fuels away from this commitment that it seemed the world was at the verge of making to phase out fossil fuels. So that was the oil-rich countries in Saudi Arabia. But there was another parallel process happening, according to developing nations, which involved developed countries dialing down the language on financial commitments for poorer countries in other bits of the text. So this is a huge kind of balanced document with all sorts of different themes in there. And there was a lot of anger amongst the developing world about the fact that the financial commitments that they say aren't just required to make it happen, but are kind of a moral duty of the developed countries which got rich burning fossil fuels, that they just weren't there. So we'll see whether this text negotiates that really tricky path and fashions a compromise that everyone can sign up to. Remember, 198 countries, and the test is consensus, really tricky. But we know that with compromises like that, almost everyone is normally left feeling a bit bruised and hurt and not satisfied by the outcome. So it's a really tricky task here.
Justin Rowlatt, thank you very much. We'll leave you to wait for the outcome when it comes. Claire, are you disappointed, like so many countries and representatives are, by the fact that it doesn't look at the moment from the draft commentary that there won't be this phrase fossil fuel phase out?
I think the fossil fuels are essential for energy equality. And I think it's interesting that parts of the developing world, China, India, Brazil, not just the petro regimes, are realising that in order for them to be able to develop and have industrial revolutions, have steel, be able to grow into an economic country like the West, that they actually are resistant to the way that fossil fuels are being, in a way, demonised. Everybody knows it's important to be responsible about the planet and about the climate and so on. But I do think that it's interesting that COP28 has seen a breach. And we've even seen domestically, when ordinary people realise what net zero targets will cost them, they say, what are you talking about? This becomes like a sort of virtue signalling. Just briefly. Finally, we brought out, Academy of Ideas brought out a letter on liberty called Green's the New Neo-Colonialists. And I think that for all of the decolonisers around, it's worth considering what exactly the West are demanding of countries that are trying to develop it.
Nancy?
It always just seems to come down to money, doesn't it? And those with the most money seem to always win. And as little people doing our recycling and some people trying to afford electric cars, it just feels like it falls on our shoulders, and the people who should be leading, the people who should be bringing the cohesion on every issue, are just falling out with each other at every single level. So we just need strong leadership. We need to solve the climate catastrophe. And if we can't do it at a very expensive international event like COP, where can we do it?
Should phase out fossil fuels be there?
It definitely should be in. I mean, you've got conflicting priorities, haven't you? And for me, the priority is to save the world. And if you call that neo-colonialism, I would say to you that the way in which we facilitate it is by generous funding to the underdeveloped economies to find alternatives, not to stop saving the world.
Do you agree with that? Should the West stump up more cash?
Well, I love these statements about let's phase out fossil fuels, and then not very much will happen. And the key here is the problem that you can only phase them out as you replace them with something else that is as functional as fossil fuels. Give you one example to finish on.
You've got no more
right
time.
Now, wind power, it falls off when there's no wind. You have a gas station sitting ready to go.
That's all we have time for.
Out gas.
Before the lights go out here, thank you to all my guests. Bye-bye.